Hey guys, tonight we're going back to some of the earliest cities on Earth to look at something surprisingly familiar: debt. Long before modern banks, credit cards, or financial systems, ancient civilizations were already borrowing, lending, keeping records, and struggling under the weight of unpaid obligations. Before we begin, feel free to subscribe if you enjoy .com/slow historical documentaries like this one. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories from the ancient world to your quiet evenings. In Mesopotamia, farmers took grain loans to survive between harvests. Merchants borrowed silver for long-distance trade. Temples and palaces acted as early financial centers, writing transactions onto clay tablets that still survive today. As Egypt, Greece, and Rome expanded, debt expanded with them. Grain banks, maritime loans, interest limits, and even debt cancellations became tools that shaped societies, supported wars, and, at times, pushed entire systems toward collapse. This is the story of how ancient people borrowed, paid, and sometimes fell apart under the burden. The earliest evidence of debt comes from the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, a region where writing first developed and where daily life depended heavily on agriculture. In these early cities, long before coins or banks existed, people recorded loans on small clay tablets. These tablets, hardened in the sun or in simple kilns, preserved thousands of entries documenting how people borrowed, what they owed, and when repayment was expected. They form one of the oldest financial archives in human history. The records come mainly from temples and palace storehouses. These institutions held large quantities of grain and silver, which acted as the primary forms of wealth. Farmers depended on seasonal harvests, and any failure in rainfall or soil conditions could leave them without enough food or seed for the next year. To manage this uncertainty, they borrowed grain at planting time. The expectation was clear: once the harvest came, they would repay the loan, often with interest measured in additional grain. These transactions were not informal agreements. They were written down carefully. A tablet might list the name of the borrower, the amount of barley loaned, the date, and the expected repayment time. The writing was standardized enough that different scribes could understand one another's records. This consistency indicates that debt was not an occasional necessity but a routine part of economic life. People borrowed and repaid throughout the year, following an established system that functioned across the region. Silver also appeared frequently in loan records. Unlike grain, silver did not spoil and could be measured in standard weights. Merchants relied on silver loans to finance long-distance trade. A trader planning a journey might borrow silver, purchase goods such as textiles or metal tools, and then repay the loan after completing the trip. Silver made it easier to conduct business across multiple cities because its value remained stable compared to agricultural products, which fluctuated with the seasons. Interest was a standard part of these loans. Mesopotamian law codes set specific rates, often around one-third the amount borrowed for grain loans and a lower rate for silver. These rates were not random. They reflected the risks associated with different types of borrowing. Grain loans depended on successful harvests, which could fail due to drought or pests. Silver loans, used mainly for trade, involved risks of travel, weather, and unexpected delays. Interest compensated lenders for these uncertainties. Temples played a central role in the early credit system. They acted as storage centers for grain collected through taxes, offerings, or agricultural surplus. When households needed assistance, the temple provided loans. This arrangement benefited both sides. Households secured resources to survive difficult seasons, while temples maintained their influence in the community. Palace institutions also issued loans, especially to workers or farmers who supported state projects. These loans created connections between rulers and the population, reinforcing administrative control. Debt, however, carried risks. In years of good harvests, farmers repaid loans without difficulty. But when harvests failed, repayment became impossible. If a borrower could not return the grain or silver on time, the debt accumulated. Interest increased the total amount owed, and repeated failures could push families into serious financial trouble. Some households pledged members of their family as temporary laborers to repay what they owed. These Practice, sometimes called debt servitude, meant that individuals worked for the lender until the obligation was fulfilled. Clay tablets show that such situations were common enough for kings to intervene. Several Mesopotamian rulers issued decrees canceling debts during times of crisis. These decrees aimed to prevent large numbers of people from losing their land or becoming bound to creditors. By restoring economic stability, kings hoped to maintain social order and ensure that farmers remained productive. These cancellations were not acts of generosity, but responses to the practical consequences of widespread financial strain. The tablets reveal much about everyday life. They show how people measured goods, how they calculated interest, and how they resolved disputes. In some cases, the tablets include witness names, indicating that loans were formal contracts requiring social confirmation. Other tablets record repayments, listing the exact amounts returned. These detailed records suggest a highly organized financial culture, one in which literacy and accountability were central to economic activity. The clay tablets also reflect the rhythm of agricultural life. Most grain loans followed seasonal cycles. Borrowers received grain at planting time, repaid after harvest, and sometimes borrowed again the following season. This predictable pattern made debt a regular part of farming rather than a sign of crisis. Families depended on these cycles to manage shortages, invest in their fields, and maintain stability from year to year. Geography played a role as well. Mesopotamia's river valleys provided fertile soil, but required irrigation systems that needed constant maintenance. When irrigation networks failed or when river levels dropped too low, crop yields declined. In these situations, debt became a mechanism that allowed communities to survive until conditions improved. The tablets show how closely financial life was tied to environmental conditions. Merchants used debt differently. Their loans supported economic expansion beyond local markets. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia with regions that produced metals, timber, or luxury goods. By financing these journeys through loans, merchants created connections between distant communities. Repaying these loans often required successful trade, which meant that debt supported not only local survival but also long-distance economic networks. From a broader perspective, clay tablets mark the beginning of a long history in which societies organized obligations through written contracts. The tablets served as proof of agreement, reducing disputes and providing a reliable way to track economic relationships. This emphasis on record-keeping shaped later financial systems, influencing how societies across the ancient world understood credit, repayment, and economic responsibility. By the time later civilizations emerged, the foundation of written debt records was well established. Mesopotamian methods influenced neighboring regions, and the idea of documenting obligations became part of administrative practice across the ancient Middle East. These early clay records show that debt was not simply an economic tool. It was a structure that connected households, institutions, and rulers, shaping relationships that would influence societies for centuries. In ancient civilizations, borrowing did not begin with coins. It began with necessities. The most common loans in early societies were simple: grain for planting and feeding a household, or silver for trade and professional activity. These two forms of credit shaped the basic structure of ancient economies. Grain supported survival, while silver supported expansion. Together, they formed the backbone of early financial life. Grain loans were especially important in agricultural societies, like Mesopotamia and Egypt. Farming families depended on predictable seasons, but harvests varied from year to year. A poor harvest could leave a household without enough seed for the following season. To manage this risk, farmers borrowed grain, often barley, in the months before planting. The expectation was straightforward. At the next harvest, they would repay the same amount plus an additional portion as interest. These agreements helped stabilize agricultural cycles and allowed farmers to continue working their land even during difficult years. The structure of grain loans reflected the rhythm of the agricultural calendar. Tablets from Mesopotamia often specify the month when grain was borrowed and the month when it was due. Because the harvest season was known in advance, repayment deadlines were predictable. Borrowing grain did not necessarily indicate poverty. It was a practical response to seasonal needs. Families took loans to secure seeds, feed livestock, or provide food until new crops were ready. In many regions, these seasonal loans occurred every year and formed part of the normal agricultural routine. Interest rates for grain loans were typically high. Mesopotamian law codes show a common interest rate of 1/3 of the loaned amount. For example, a farmer borrowing 30 liters of barley might be required to return 40. The high rate reflected the uncertainty of agriculture. Droughts, pests, or floods could ruin harvests, making repayment difficult. Lenders assumed risk, and interest compensated them for that risk. At the same time, predictable interests created clear expectations, reducing conflicts between borrowers and lenders. Silver loans operated differently. Silver was not produced locally in most Mesopotamian cities. It entered the region through trade networks that stretched into Anatolia, Iran, and beyond. For merchants, silver provided a flexible medium of exchange that could be used in many markets. A merchant borrowing silver might use it to buy textiles, tools, or livestock in one city and sell those goods in another. Silver loans supported long-distance trade and helped merchants maintain steady access to goods even when local supplies were limited. The terms of silver loans were more varied than those of grain loans. Some loans had fixed repayment dates. Others required repayment after the merchant returned from a trading journey. Because trade involved significant risk weather conditions, illness, theft, unpredictable markets, interest rates on silver loans also reflected uncertainty. Yet, they were usually lower than those on grain loans, because silver held its value more consistently than agricultural goods. Loan agreements for both grain and silver were recorded in writing. Scribes used standardized language to describe the amount borrowed, the interest rate, the due date, and the borrower's obligations. These written contracts reduced misunderstandings and helped resolve disputes. Witnesses often appeared in loan documents, indicating that these agreements were public and legally binding. The presence of witnesses also suggests that borrowing was a familiar part of community life. Collateral played a role in many loan agreements. Borrowers sometimes pledged assets such as livestock, tools, or portions of land. In cases involving silver loans, merchants might pledge future profits or specific items from their trade journeys. When borrowers could not repay on time, lenders could claim collateral according to the terms of the contract. This system tied borrowing closely to property ownership and influenced how families managed their assets. In Egypt, grain loans took a more centralized form. The state maintained large granaries that stored grain collected through taxes. These granaries not only ensured food security, but also acted as early financial institutions. When households needed grain for planting or consumption, they received measured amounts directly from the state. Repayment returned grain to the granary after the harvest. This system allowed the government to regulate food supplies and maintain stability during famines or shortages. The organization of grain banks in Egypt shows how borrowing could become part of state policy. Granaries operated under strict accounting systems. Scribes recorded every loan and repayment, sometimes noting the condition of the grain or the size of the harvest. These records reveal how closely the state monitored agricultural production. By managing grain loans, the government ensured that farmers remained productive and that the agricultural system remained stable. In Greece, the nature of loans expanded beyond grain and silver. Maritime loans became common in port cities. These loans supported trade voyages by providing funds for ships, crews, and cargo. The lender assumed risk based on the success of the voyage. If the ship returned safely, the loan was repaid with interest. If the ship was lost, the borrower was often released from obligation. This arrangement encouraged maritime trade while acknowledging the dangers of sea travel. Written contracts for maritime loans survive from classical Athens, showing how carefully these agreements were structured. Silver loans also played an important role in Greek and Roman economies. Roman citizens borrowed silver to expand businesses, purchase property, or cover expenses during economic down. Interest rates varied according to law, and regulation changed across different periods. In some eras, the government attempted to limit interest to protect citizens from excessive debt. However, enforcement varied, and debt remained a persistent issue in Roman society. Grain and silver loans influenced the structure of ancient economies by allowing farmers and merchants to access resources before they physically had them. Credit smoothed out fluctuations, in production and trade. Borrowing turned uncertain seasons into manageable cycles and allowed commerce to expand across regions. At the same time, the risks of borrowing created vulnerabilities. Households depended on successful harvests or profitable trade to remain solvent. When crops failed or journeys ended poorly, the burden of debt could become overwhelming. Archaeological records capture this balance between opportunity and risk. Clay tablets list debts repaid without difficulty, showing the reliability of seasonal cycles. Other tablets record disputes, missed deadlines, or agreements to extend repayment. These variations reflect the realities of ancient life, where weather, markets, and personal circumstances shaped financial stability. The practice of borrowing continued to expand as civilizations grew more complex. Grain and silver loans formed a foundation for more sophisticated financial systems. By establishing clear rules for lending and repayment, ancient societies created structures that would influence later developments in law, trade, and economic organization. These early forms of credit helped shape both the opportunities available to individuals and the challenges they faced in their daily lives. In the earliest civilizations, religious institutions played a role far larger than worship alone. Temples in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other ancient regions often functioned as economic hubs, storing surplus resources and distributing them through carefully organized systems. Because they held grain, livestock, and precious materials, temples naturally became centers for lending and record-keeping. Their stability, wealth, and administrative capacity allowed them to operate as some of the first financial institutions in history. In Mesopotamia, temples stood at the center of urban life. Their architecture dominated city skylines, and their storehouses held the community's most important resources. Farmers paid offerings or taxes to temples, usually in the form of grain. Over time, these offerings accumulated, creating large reserves. These reserves became a practical safety net for the surrounding population. When a household needed grain for planting or food for daily survival, it approached the temple for a loan. Temple lending followed clear procedures. Scribes documented each transaction on clay tablets. The tablets recorded the borrower's name, the amount loaned, the type of grain, and the expected repayment. Some tablets also listed the field from which repayment would be drawn or the date by which the grain must be returned. These detailed records allowed temples to monitor large numbers of loans and ensure accountability. The consistency of the writing indicates an administrative system designed to handle financial activity on a substantial scale. Temples maintained the authority to enforce repayment, but their role was not solely punitive. Because temples were central to community life, their lending practices supported social stability. When a household faced hardship, the ability to borrow grain prevented immediate crises. At the same time, the expectation of repayment kept the system functioning. This balance between support and structure allowed temple economies to sustain large urban populations. In addition to grain, temples often held silver and other valuable materials. These resources accumulated through offerings, trade relations, or state contributions. Silver loans were less common than grain loans, but carried significant influence, especially for merchants. A merchant planning a trading journey might borrow silver from the temple to purchase goods for resale. The profit from the journey allowed the merchant to repay the temple with interest. This system supported economic expansion and linked local temple economies to long-distance trade networks. The temple's economic activities extended beyond lending. They also managed labor, land, and production. Temples owned fields cultivated by workers who produced grain both for temple use and for the wider community. They employed craftsmen who made textiles, pottery, and metal goods. These products could be exchanged in local markets or offered to the temple as part of religious obligations. Because temples coordinated these economic activities, they held a central position in both spiritual and material life. In Egypt, temple and state granaries formed an interconnected system of storage and distribution. Like their Mesopotamian counterparts, Egyptian temples collected grain through offerings and taxes. Granaries managed by priests or state officials stored these resources and issued loans when needed. The scale of Egyptian grain storage was immense, with some granaries containing hundreds of thousands of sacks. This capacity allowed Egypt to withstand periods of poor harvests and maintain stability across wide regions. Egyptian records, often written on papyrus or carved into stone, describe the movement of grain, into and out of granaries. Officials kept careful lists of quantities, types of grain, and storage conditions. When a household borrowed grain, a scribe documented the loan, the expected repayment, and the condition of the grain. This level of organization allowed the state to track agricultural production and ensure that grain reserves remained dependable. Like Mesopotamian temples, Egyptian temples played a role in broader economic life. They owned land, operated workshops, and employed farmers and craftsmen. The wealth generated from these activities strengthened temple influence and contributed to the regional economy. Because temples acted as trusted institutions, people viewed them as stable sources of credit during uncertain times. In the Levant and Anatolia, temples also held economic significance. At Ugarit, for example, tablets showed that temples engaged in lending and recorded transactions involving grain, oil, and silver. These records indicate that temple economies were widespread across the Near East, forming a shared pattern of institutional financial activity. The reach of these temple economies connected multiple regions through consistent practices of record-keeping and resource management. The role of temples as financial centers shaped the social structure of early civilizations. Temples held authority not only through religious influence but also through their economic power. Their lending activities created obligations that linked households to temple institutions. Repaying loans meant returning grain to the temple storehouses, participating in community labor, or contributing to temple projects. These obligations reinforced the temple's central role in urban governance. Temples also functioned as places where disputes over loans could be resolved. Because scribes maintained clear records, disagreements over repayment could be settled by consulting written documents. This reliance on written contracts helped build trust in the lending system. It also contributed to the development of early legal structures, in which economic obligations became formalized through writing and witnessed agreements. The combination of religious authority and economic administration gave temples a unique position in society. Their ability to store resources, issue credit, and enforce repayment made them essential to community stability. At the same time, their role in production and trade linked them to wider economic networks. Temples were not simply houses of worship. They were administrative centers responsible for managing the flow of goods and labor. The influence of temple economies continued long after secular institutions gained prominence. Even as palace administrations and later civic governments expanded their roles, temples remained significant financial actors. Their records provide some of the most detailed documentation of ancient economic life. Through these records, historians can trace the patterns of borrowing and repayment, the rhythms of agricultural cycles, and the ways in which communities managed risk. Temples shaped early credit systems in ways that extended far beyond their immediates. By providing loans, they supported farming, trade, and household survival. By maintaining detailed records, they established standards for documentation that influenced later administrative practices. Their role in managing both resources and obligations made them foundational to the development of financial systems across the ancient world. As societies grew more complex, temples continued to adapt, participating in systems that combined religious, economic, and political authority. Their early role in lending reveals how intertwined these functions were, and how essential organized institutions were to the development of long-lasting civilizations. The earliest documented interest rates in human history come from Mesopotamia, where scribes recorded the precise terms of loans on clay tablets. These tablets show that interest was not an informal or negotiated detail. It was standardized, regulated, and deeply integrated into daily economic life. The presence of fixed interest rates demonstrates how early societies understood the risks involved in lending and created predictable structures to manage those risks. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 before the Common Era, contains clear statements about interest. It specifies standard rates, often 1/3 of the principal for grain loans, and lower but still substantial rates for silver loans. These laws were not new inventions. They reflected practices already well established by earlier cities. The codification simply placed long-standing customs into a formal legal framework. Grain interest was typically measured directly in barley, the staple crop of Mesopotamia. A tablet might record that a borrower received 30 liters of barley and owed 40 at harvest time. This increase represented both the cost of borrowing and the risk borne by the lender. Grain loans were seasonal, and their repayment depended heavily on successful harvests. A bad year could make repayment difficult, so interest rates compensated for that unpredictability. Silver loans involved different considerations, because silver retained its value better than grain and did not rely on seasonal cycles. Interest rates for silver were generally lower. Tablets record common rates of about 20% annually. This rate reflected the relative stability of silver as a medium of exchange, and the risks associated with trade rather than agriculture. A merchant borrowing silver to fund a journey might face dangers such as storms, theft, or market changes, but these risks were more predictable than agricultural failures caused by drought or pests. Interest was not viewed as a penalty, but as an expected part of economic exchange. Lenders provided valuable resources in advance. Borrowers gained immediate access to grain or silver, allowing them to plant fields, sustain households, or fund journeys. In return, repayment included a portion that acknowledged the lender's contribution and the uncertainties involved. This system supported a balanced relationship between borrowers and lenders, as long as the economic environment remained stable. Scribes played an essential role in documenting interest. Their tablets used consistent formulas. The name of the borrower, the amount loaned, the type of commodity, the expected interest, and the due date. This standardized documentation reduced the likelihood of disputes and provided clear evidence in cases of disagreement. Because contracts were written, they could be stored, referenced, and enforced over long periods. The reliability of written records strengthened trust in the credit system. Some tablets revealed the consequences of unpaid interest. When borrowers missed repayment deadlines, the debt continued to accumulate. Additional interests increased the total amount owed, sometimes pushing families into deeper financial difficulty. Yet these situations were also governed by law. The Code of Hammurabi limited how much interest could accumulate and set rules preventing excessive exploitation. These regulations helped maintain social stability by preventing lenders from gaining too much power over borrowers. Interest rates were not uniform across all cities or time periods. Different regions adapted the general principles of lending to their specific conditions. In some areas, interest could be paid not only in grain or silver, but also through labor or service. For example, a borrower who lacked sufficient grain at harvest might repay part of the debt by working on the lender's land or assisting with irrigation projects. These alternative forms of repayment show how flexible the credit system could be in adapting to local circumstances. Agricultural cycles influenced interest practices. Borrowers usually took loans during planting season and repaid them after harvest. This cycle meant that interest was tied closely to the rhythm of the natural world. Good harvests made interest manageable. Poor harvests increased the burden. The link between debt and agriculture explains why rulers occasionally canceled debts during periods of crises. When entire regions faced crop failure, widespread debt could threaten social stability. Debt cancellations allowed families to recover and begin the agricultural cycle again without the weight of unpayable obligations. Silver loans follow different cycles depending on trade. Merchants often borrowed before embarking on a journey and repaid after selling goods. Interest compensated lenders for the time during which their silver was unavailable and for the risks inherent in long-distance travel. Because trade routes connected Mesopotamia to distant regions, silver loans tied local economies to broader networks of exchange. The presence of interest also reveals something about ancient views of time and obligation. Loans were not open-ended. They had clear deadlines aligned with natural or commercial cycles. Borrowers and lenders understood these expectations, and the written contracts reinforced a shared understanding of when repayment was due. This predictability made the system functional, even when economic conditions were unstable. Archaeological excavations have uncovered thousands of tablets from administrative centers, private homes, and temple archives. Many of these tablets include interest calculations, confirming how widespread the practice was. Some tablets even instruct scribes on how to compute interest, showing that mathematical training formed part of scribal education. The ability to calculate interest accurately contributed to the emergence of early mathematics in Mesopotamia, linking financial needs with intellectual development. Interest rates in Mesopotamia influenced later civilizations. The idea of standardized interest spread to the Levant, Anatolia, and eventually Greece. Ancient Greek loans often included rates that mirrored earlier Mesopotamian patterns. In Rome, interest became a central topic of legal debate, with various laws attempting to regulate acceptable rates. The basic concept of paying for the use of borrowed resources became a durable feature of Mediterranean financial culture. The long history of interest in Mesopotamia shows that lending was not a marginal activity but a core part of economic life. Fixed rates, formal contracts, and regulated practices allowed borrowing to function smoothly across generations. These structures supported agriculture, trade, and urban stability, connecting households, merchants, and institutions through clear financial relationships, while later societies introduced new forms of currency, banking, and credit. The fundamental principles shaped in Mesopotamia continued to guide borrowing and lending for centuries. The ancient system of interest created a framework for economic exchange that influenced not only Mesopotamia but much of the ancient world that followed. The earliest documented interest rates in human history come from Mesopotamia, where scribes recorded the precise terms of loans on clay tablets. These tablets show that interest was not an informal or negotiated detail. It was standardized, regulated, and deeply integrated into daily economic life. The presence of fixed interest rates demonstrates how early societies understood the risks involved in lending and created predictable structures to manage those risks. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 before the Common Era, contains clear statements about interest. It specifies standard rates, often 1/3 of the principal for grain loans, and lower but still substantial rates for silver loans. These laws were not new inventions. They reflected practices already well established by earlier cities. The codification simply placed long-standing customs into a formal legal framework. Grain interest was typically measured directly in barley, the staple crop of Mesopotamia. A tablet might record that a borrower received 30 liters of barley and owed 40 at harvest time. This increase represented both the cost of borrowing and the risk borne by the lender. Grain loans were seasonal, and their repayment depended heavily on successful harvests. A bad year could make repayment difficult, so interest rates compensated for that unpredictability. Silver loans involved different considerations, because silver retained its value better than grain and did not rely on seasonal cycles. Interest rates for silver were generally lower. Tablets record common rates of about 20% annually. This rate reflected the relative stability of silver as a medium of exchange, and the risks associated with trade rather than agriculture. A merchant borrowing silver to fund a journey might face dangers such as storms, theft, or market changes, but these risks were more predictable than agricultural failures caused by drought or pests. Interest was not viewed as a penalty, but as an expected part of economic exchange. Lenders provided valuable resources in advance. Borrowers gained immediate access to grain or silver, allowing them to plant fields, sustain households, or fund journeys. In return, repayment included a portion that acknowledged the lender's contribution and the uncertainties involved. This system supported a balanced relationship between borrowers and lenders, as long as the economic environment remained stable. Scribes played an essential role in documenting interest. Their tablets used consistent formulas: the name of the borrower, the amount loaned, the type of commodity, the expected interest, and the due date. This standardized documentation reduced the likelihood of disputes and provided clear evidence in cases of disagreement. Because contracts were written, they could be stored, referenced, and enforced over long periods. The reliability of written records strengthened trust in the credit system. Some tablets revealed the consequences of unpaid interest. When borrowers missed repayment deadlines, the debt continued to accumulate. Additional interests increased the total amount owed, sometimes pushing families into deeper financial difficulty. Yet these situations were also governed by law. The Code of Hammurabi limited how much interest could accumulate and set rules preventing excessive exploitation. These regulations helped maintain social stability by preventing lenders from gaining too much power over borrowers. Interest rates were not uniform across all cities or time periods. Different regions adapted the general principles of lending to their specific conditions. In some areas, interest could be paid not only in grain or silver, but also through labor or service. For example, a borrower who lacked sufficient grain at harvest might repay part of the debt by working on the lender's land or assisting with irrigation projects. These alternative forms of repayment show how flexible the credit system could be in adapting to local circumstances. Agricultural cycles influenced interest practices. Borrowers usually took loans during planting season and repaid them after harvest. This cycle meant that interest was tied closely to the rhythm of the natural world. Good harvests made interest manageable, Poor harvests increased the burden. The link between debt and agriculture explains why rulers occasionally canceled debts during periods of crises. When entire regions faced crop failure, widespread debt could threaten social stability. Debt cancellations allowed families to recover and begin the agricultural cycle again without the weight of unpayable obligations. Silver loans follow different cycles depending on trade. Merchants often borrowed before embarking on a journey and repaid after selling goods. Interest compensated lenders for the time during which their silver was unavailable and for the risks inherent in long-distance travel. Because trade routes connected Mesopotamia to distant regions, silver loans tied local economies to broader networks of exchange. The presence of interest also reveals something about ancient views of time and obligation. Loans were not open-ended. They had clear deadlines aligned with natural or commercial cycles. Borrowers and lenders understood these expectations, and the written contracts reinforced a shared understanding of when repayment was due. This predictability made the system functional, even when economic conditions were unstable. Archaeological excavations have uncovered thousands of tablets from administrative centers, private homes, and temple archives. Many of these tablets include interest calculations, confirming how widespread the practice was. Some tablets even instruct scribes on how to compute interest, showing that mathematical training formed part of scribal education. The ability to calculate interest accurately contributed to the emergence of early mathematics in Mesopotamia, linking financial needs with intellectual development. Interest rates in Mesopotamia influenced later civilizations. The idea of standardized interest spread to the Levant, Anatolia, and eventually Greece. Ancient Greek loans often included rates that mirrored earlier Mesopotamian patterns. In Rome, interest became a central topic of legal debate, with various laws attempting to regulate acceptable rates. The basic concept of paying for the use of borrowed resources became a durable feature of Mediterranean financial culture. The long history of interest in Mesopotamia shows that lending was not a marginal activity but a core part of economic life. Fixed rates, formal contracts, and regulated practices allowed borrowing to function smoothly across generations. These structures supported agriculture, trade, and urban stability, connecting households, merchants, and institutions through clear financial relationships, while later societies introduced new forms of currency, banking, and credit. The fundamental principles shaped in Mesopotamia continued to guide borrowing and lending for centuries. The ancient system of interest created a framework for economic exchange that influenced not only Mesopotamia but much of the ancient world that followed. In the ancient world, debt could accumulate quickly, especially during years of poor harvests or military disruption. When too many households became trapped in unpayable obligations, societies risked instability. To address these crises, several early rulers introduced a powerful tool: the cancellation of debts. These decrees, often issued at the beginning of a king's reign or during periods of hardship, erased obligations, freed debt servants, and returned land to its original owners. Debt cancellation was not merely an act of generosity. It was a strategic measure designed to restore social balance and ensure the continued functioning of the economy. Mesopotamian kings were among the earliest to issue such decrees. Tablets from the cities of Sumer and Old Babylon show examples of proclamations known as clean slates or freedom decrees. These decrees canceled many types of personal debts, including grain loans, silver loans, and obligations that had resulted in debt servitude. In some cases, the decrees specifically freed individuals who had entered labor service to repay their debts, allowing them to return to their households. By restoring these individuals to their families, rulers reinforced the structure of the agricultural workforce, which was essential for maintaining food production. These cancellations followed established patterns. A new king would often proclaim a cancellation at the start of his reign. This action strengthened his legitimacy by presenting him as a protector of the population. It also earned the support of farmers and laborers, who formed the backbone of the economy. The decree signaled that the king saw himself as responsible for maintaining justice and order. In periods of crises when harvests failed, wars disrupted trade, or large numbers of people fell into servitude, additional cancellations might be issued to stabilize society. The language of these decrees was formal and consistent. They declared specific types of debts, null and void, listed categories of individuals to be freed, and outlined the obligations of creditors. Creditors were often required to return land, tools, or family members who had been taken as collateral. These decrees did not erase all obligations. Commercial loans involving merchants or large institutions sometimes remained in place. The focus was primarily on personal debts that affected farmers, laborers, and small households. Debt cancellations revealed the close relationship between economic conditions and political authority. When households became overwhelmed by debt, they faced the possibility of losing land, livestock, or family labor. This loss weakened agricultural productivity and threatened the supply of food. By canceling debts, rulers sought to restore productive capacity. The decrees helped farmers resume work on their fields without the burden of accumulated obligations, supporting food security and reducing the risk of social unrest. In addition to restoring stability, debt cancellations reinforced the authority of the central government. They showed that the ruler could intervene in the economic system when necessary, and that his decisions held legal force across the kingdom. These actions sent a clear message. The king had the power to reshape financial relationships to maintain societal balance. This authority was grounded in religious and political traditions that portrayed rulers as guarantors of justice. Egypt provides another example of state intervention in economic obligations. Although large-scale debt cancellations are less documented in Egyptian sources than in Mesopotamian ones, the state frequently adjusted tax obligations and extended support during periods of hardship. Grain shortages caused by floods or droughts often led to temporary relief measures. These measures, while not always described as cancellations, served similar purposes. They helped households recover from difficult years and kept agricultural production stable. In the Near East, the tradition of debt cancellations spread across regions. Documents from the city of Ugarit show that rulers there also intervened to relieve households of unpayable obligations during crises. These cancellations protected vulnerable populations and maintained the productivity of farms that supplied the palace and temple systems. The widespread use of these decrees indicates that ancient societies recognized the dangers of letting debt accumulate unchecked. In Greece, debt played a central role in early social conflict. Before the reforms of Solon in the early 6th century, before the Common Era, many Athenian citizens faced the threat of becoming enslaved for debt. The accumulation of debts created serious social tension, prompting demands for reform. Solon's famous sysechthia, or shaking off of burdens, eliminated personal debts secured on the person, freed individuals already enslaved for debt, and prohibited the use of a person's body as collateral in future loans. These changes did not cancel all debts, but they removed the most severe consequences for borrowers and marked a major shift in Athenian legal and social life. Solon's reforms highlight a pattern similar to that seen in Mesopotamia. When debt threatened the stability of society, political leaders intervened. By freeing citizens from overwhelming obligations, Solon reduced social tensions and allowed the city to continue developing its political institutions. His actions demonstrated that debt was not only an economic issue but also a political one that could shape the trajectory of an entire community. In Rome, the issue of debt cancellations appeared repeatedly during the early Republic. Debt crises contributed to social movements and conflicts between patricians and plebeians. At times, the government intervened to alleviate burdens, though these measures were often temporary and limited in scope. Roman solutions focused more on regulating interest rates or restructuring repayment terms rather than issuing broad cancellations. Nevertheless, the repeated appearance of debt in political debates shows how deeply it affected Roman society. Debt cancellations also reveal the limitations of ancient financial systems. Without formal bankruptcy processes or welfare structures, households relied on debt to manage risk. But when too many households fell into debt at once, the entire economic system could become strained. Canceling debts reset the system, allowing households to recover and continue contributing to the economy. This reset function acted as a safeguard against economic collapse. In regions heavily dependent on agriculture, archaeological evidence provides insight into how widespread cancellations were. Tablets referencing canceled debts appear across centuries, often grouped around certain reigns. Some tablets list individuals restored to their households, showing how the decrees affected daily life. Others reference the return of land or tools previously taken as collateral. These records demonstrate the broad scope of cancellations and their importance in maintaining long-term stability. Debt cancellations influenced how societies perceived their leaders. Rulers who issued cancellations were often remembered for their fairness and ability to protect the population. These actions connected political authority with economic justice, reinforcing the idea that a stable society required careful management of obligations. At the same time, the regular need for cancellations shows how fragile early economies could be, especially when dependent on unpredictable harvests or external pressures. Through these practices, ancient societies developed a system in which rulers played an active role in managing economic strain. Debt cancellations did not eliminate financial difficulties, but they prevented them from overwhelming communities. By restoring balance, rulers ensured that agricultural and economic systems could continue functioning across generations. In ancient Egypt, debt and lending developed within a highly organized state structure, unlike Mesopotamia, where temples and private lenders held much of the financial activity. Egypt relied heavily on central administration. The state controlled grain storage, tax collection, and distribution across the Nile Valley, creating a system where lending became a natural extension of government management. Because the Nile's seasonal floods shaped agricultural rhythms. Egypt built institutions capable of smoothing out shortages and supporting households through cycles of abundance and scarcity. Grain served as the foundation of Egyptian lending. Egypt's economy depended on the annual flood of the Nile, which deposited nutrient-rich silt on farmlands. When the flood levels were ideal, harvests were abundant, but if floods were too low or too high, yields declined. To maintain stability, the state collected grain taxes and stored large quantities in granaries, located in administrative centers, temples, and estates. These granaries functioned both as reserves and as lending institutions. When households needed grain, whether for planting, feeding livestock, or sustaining family members, they received measured amounts from the state. Each withdrawal was recorded by scribes, who used carefully maintained lists to track quantities and dates. Grain was not simply handed out as charity. It was issued with the expectation of repayment after the harvest. This approach allowed the state to maintain reliable reserves, while helping farmers cope with the uncertainties of agricultural life. Papyrus documents showed the precision of Egyptian records. Scribes wrote entries that listed the borrower's name, the volume of grain taken, the type of container used, and the expected date of repayment. Some documents specify whether the grain was lent for agricultural use or for consumption. Others record partial repayments or adjustments due to damaged crops. The clarity of these records reflects a system built on accountability and standardized procedures. State lending extended beyond grain. Some temples operated their own storage facilities and issued loans independently. Temples owned land, employed workers, and produced goods. Their granaries functioned similarly to those of the state, supporting agricultural cycles and local economies. But the central government maintained the largest and most coordinated lending system, ensuring that grain reserves could be distributed where they were needed most. Interest played a role in Egyptian lending, though it appeared differently than in Mesopotamia. Some loans required repayment of slightly more grain than was borrowed, reflecting interest in practical terms. In other cases, repayment obligations took the form of labor contributions, such as helping maintain irrigation canals or performing duties on state projects. Because Egypt had an extensive system of labor obligations known as corvée labor, the integration of debt repayment into these activities was efficient and predictable. The structure of Egyptian state lending was closely tied to agricultural administration. Officials monitored flood levels each year and adjusted expectations based on the predicted harvest. When the flood was too low to support crops, the state prepared for increased lending and potential delays in repayment. In years of abundant harvests, granaries replenished their stocks, ensuring long-term stability. This cyclical awareness allowed Egypt to manage food supplies more effectively than many contemporary societies. State involvement in lending also influenced social and economic relationships. Because grain loans came from government granaries, households interacted regularly with administrative officials. These interactions shaped perceptions of the state as both a source of support and an authority responsible for oversight. Compliance with tax obligations ensured access to future loans, reinforcing social hierarchies rooted in administrative order. Land ownership played a key role in the lending system. Much of the arable land in Egypt belonged to the crown, temples, or elite households. Farmers working these lands paid taxes and grain, which flowed into granaries and supported lending operations. When debts accumulated, the state could reassign land, adjust labor obligations, or modify repayment terms to maintain productivity. The ability to intervene directly in land management gave the government tools to stabilize the economy during periods of strain. Egyptian lending practices also intersected with religious beliefs. Tempesis managed grain reserves not only for economic purposes, but also as part of ritual obligations. Offerings and temple estates contributed to granary stocks, linking the act of lending with sacred functions. The system reflected a worldview in which material and spiritual responsibilities were connected. Temples served both divine and administrative roles, reinforcing their position in society. The role of grain banks extended to workforce management. When large construction projects began, such as building temples, canals, or storage facilities, the state distributed grain to laborers as payment or sustenance. These distributions formed part of the economic cycle, with grain serving as both a commodity and a medium of exchange. In some cases, workers who received grain advances were recorded as borrowers expected to repay through labor contributions. This practice blurred the line between wages, loans, and tax obligations. Egypt's centralized approach to lending had long-term effects on its stability. By managing grain reserves and offering loans during shortages, the state reduced the risk of widespread famine. This capacity allowed Egypt to maintain relatively consistent agricultural productivity across centuries. Even when political power shifted between dynasties, the administrative structures supporting grain lending remained intact, reflecting their deep integration into Egyptian society. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. Excavations at ancient granaries reveal large storage rooms with carefully designed ventilation systems to preserve grain. Measuring vessels found near these sites match those described in papyrus documents, confirming the standardized nature of the lending process. Ostracopuses of pottery used for writing contain notes about grain deliveries, repayments, and labor obligations, showing how widespread and detailed the system was. Grain lending also shaped regional interaction along the Nile. Because the flood varied across different parts of the river, some regions experienced shortages, while others enjoyed abundance. The state used boats to transport grain between districts, smoothing out local imbalances. This redistribution relied on accurate records and coordinated administration, showcasing the complexity of Egypt's economic management. While Egyptian lending focused primarily on grain, some silver lending did exist, especially in later periods when long-distance trade increased. Silver loans followed similar principles to those in Mesopotamia, with written contracts and expectations of repayment. But grain remained at the center of Egypt's credit system because it reflected the agricultural foundation of the economy. The structure of Egyptian state lending reveals how debt functioned within a centralized, bureaucratic society. It allowed households to survive difficult seasons, supported agricultural productivity, and reinforced administrative authority. By managing grain reserves and integrating lending into broader systems of labor and taxation, Egypt created a credit system that balanced practical needs with long-term stability. Through these practices, ancient Egypt demonstrates how debt and lending can operate as part of a coordinated state effort rather than relying solely on private lenders. This approach shaped not only the economy but also the political and social landscape of the Nile Valley, leaving a legacy that influenced later institutions in the region. In the ancient Greek world, credit played a central role in supporting trade, agriculture, and daily urban life. While Greece did not have large centralized grain banks like Egypt, it developed a wide range of lending practices that reflected its diverse economy, from small local loans between individuals to complex maritime credit arrangements. Greek financial life demonstrated flexibility and adaptation to the needs of different regions, especially city-states with active commercial networks. Agricultural lending formed one of the earliest and most common types of credit in Greece. Small farmers often borrowed seed, tools, or money to prepare fields for planting. Because agricultural cycles depended on rainfall and soil quality, these loans resembled those found in other ancient societies. Repayment was expected after the harvest, and interest compensated lenders for risk. Greek land was generally less fertile than the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. making crop failure a recurring concern. Borrowing allowed farmers to manage unpredictable yields and sustain production from year to year. Greek legal records show that loans could be secured with land or future harvests. In some rural communities, lenders received a portion of the borrower's crops as repayment. This arrangement tied credit directly to agricultural output and provided a predictable structure for both parties. When harvests were poor, however, borrowers risked losing part of their land or facing long-term financial strain. These pressures contributed to early social problems, such as the debt crises that eventually led to reforms in Athens. Urban lending expanded significantly as Greek city-states developed specialized economies. In cities like Athens, Corinth, and Milan, craftsmen, traders, and shopkeepers relied on credit to support daily operations. Loans helped merchants purchase stock, allowed workshop owners to buy raw materials, and gave artisans resources to produce goods for sale. These loans created a steady flow of economic activity within the city walls and supported the growth of markets and workshops. Greek lenders often operated privately rather than through temples or state institutions. Wealthy individuals, merchants, and families provided loans, sometimes as part of their investment activities. Contracts recorded the terms, interest rates, and repayment schedules. Written agreements helped resolve disputes and reduced uncertainty for both parties. Greek courts handled cases of non-payment, reflecting the integration of debt into civic legal systems. Interest rates varied widely depending on the type of loan. Ordinary personal or commercial loans might carry moderate rates, but maritime loans, one of the most distinctive features of Greek credit systems, followed different rules. Maritime loans were created specifically for sea trade, which was both essential and dangerous. Greek city-states relied heavily on maritime commerce, transporting goods such as olive oil, wine, pottery, and textiles across the Mediterranean. Because ship voyages faced risks, including storms, piracy, shipwrecks, and unpredictable markets, lenders needed compensation for potential losses. Maritime loans addressed this by tying repayment to the success of the voyage. If the ship returned safely, the borrower repaid the loan with interest. If the ship was lost at sea, the borrower often owed nothing. This principle linking repayment to safe arrival played a role similar to modern insurance. It distributed risk between traders and lenders and encouraged investment in long-distance trade. Contracts for maritime loans survived from Athens, especially from the 4th century, before the Common Era. These contracts describe the ship's route, the type of cargo, the interest rate, and the conditions of repayment. Some specify interest rates of 20 to 30%, reflecting the dangers of sea travel. Others detail how the borrower must use the money, such as purchasing goods in a specific port or transporting cargo along a particular route. These precise terms highlight the importance of clarity in managing risk. Greek credit systems also involved partnerships. Merchants sometimes pooled resources to finance trade ventures, sharing both profit and risk. These partnerships resembled early forms of joint investment, allowing traders to undertake larger projects than they could manage alone. Credit supported these arrangements by providing capital that expanded the reach of Greek commerce. Temples in Greece occasionally participated in lending, though not to the same extent as Mesopotamian or Egyptian temples. Some temples accumulated wealth through offerings and land ownership. They sometimes loaned money to individuals or city-states, often at interest rates similar to private lenders. These temple loans appear in inscriptions that record financial transactions linked to religious institutions. However, temples did not dominate Greek credit systems. They simply complemented a primarily private lending environment that also appeared in the political life of Greek cities. Before Solon's reforms in Athens, many farmers who could not repay loans risked losing their land or being reduced to personal bondage. This situation created widespread tension and contributed to the social debates that led to the creation of new laws. Solon's reforms eliminated the most severe consequences of debt and prevented the use of a person as body as collateral. These changes marked a significant shift in how credit and citizenship intersected. Despite these reforms, debt remained an ordinary part of Athenian life. Citizens borrowed for festivals, legal expenses, property purchases, and business ventures. Non-citizens and resident foreigners also participated in credit systems, especially in commercial activities. The presence of multiple groups engaged in lending and borrowing shows how deeply credit was integrated into the urban economy. Archaeological evidence from Greek settlements includes inscribed pottery shards, stone inscriptions, and papyrus documents that detail loans, repayments, and legal disputes. These materials reveal a dynamic financial culture in which credit supported both everyday needs and large-scale commercial activity. They also show regional differences. Island communities relied heavily on maritime credit, while inland regions focused more on agricultural loans. Greek credit systems influenced later financial practices across the Mediterranean. The flexibility of maritime loans, the use of written contracts, and the integration of credit into civic law provided models that later societies adapted. Greek merchants traveled widely, carrying their financial practices with them and helping spread these ideas across trading networks. The diversity of Greek lending systems reflected the interconnected nature of ancient Greek life. Agriculture, trade, law, and politics were all shaped by credit in different ways. Whether supporting a farmer through a difficult season or financing a ship's journey across the sea, loans provided the foundation for economic activity. The ability to borrow allowed individuals and communities to manage uncertainty, expand commercial networks, and participate in the wider Mediterranean economy. These systems formed a bridge between earlier temple-based lending and the more formal financial institutions that appeared later in history. Greek credit practices showed how lending could evolve in response to trade, urbanization, and legal structures, demonstrating the adaptability of ancient economies. As Rome expanded from a small city-state into a vast Mediterranean empire, debt became a defining force in both private life and public politics. Unlike more centralized systems in Egypt or temple-centered ones in Mesopotamia, Roman debt combined personal financial obligations with legal structures that shaped the rights and responsibilities of citizens. These debt relationships influenced family life, property ownership, military service, and political conflict. Through centuries of growth, reform, and crises, debt remained an ever-present part of Roman society. In early Rome, credit relationships were built around personal trust and social status. Wealthy citizens lent money to neighbors, clients, and business partners. These loans supported farming, trade, and daily expenses. Contracts were often oral in the earliest periods, relying on witnesses or symbolic gestures to confirm agreement. Over time, however, written contracts became more common, especially as Rome's economy expanded and required more formal mechanisms for recording obligations. Roman farmers frequently relied on loans to sustain agricultural production. Many small farmers owned modest plots of land and depended on seasonal yields. When crops failed or when families needed resources for planting, borrowing allowed them to continue working the land, but the burden of repayment could be heavy, especially when interest accumulated or when lenders demanded repayment during difficult seasons. Debt, therefore, shaped the fortunes of rural households and contributed to wider social tensions. One of the most distinctive features of early Roman debt was the institution known as and the nexum, a borrower pledged their personal labor as security for a loan. If the borrower failed to repay on time, the lender could claim the debtor's service until the obligation was fulfilled. This system resembled debt servitude in Mesopotamia, but operated within the legal framework of Roman citizenship. Debtors retained certain rights, yet the potential for exploitation created significant strain. Stories of harsh treatment of debtors appear in early Roman writings and helped spark demands for legal reform. Debt also influenced military service. In the early Republic, citizens who fell into debt could sometimes be barred from serving in the army, since military equipment was expensive and required personal investment. This exclusion had political implications. The ability to serve in the army was linked to political participation, so debt could limit a citizen's role in public life. These connections between economic obligations and civic rights played a major role in early social conflicts. Tensions between wealthy creditors and indebted citizens contributed to the long struggle between patricians and plebeians. Debt crises repeatedly fueled unrest, prompting plebeians to demand legal protections. One of the earliest major political reforms, the Law of the 12 Tables, attempted to regulate debt practices by specifying procedures for repayment and limiting abuses against debtors. Although the law did not eliminate debt servitude, it provided clearer guidelines and reduced the power of creditors to act arbitrarily. Throughout the Republic, debt remained a recurring political issue. Plebeian tribunes advocated for relief measures, and at times, large groups of indebted citizens protested or withdrew from public service to pressure the government. These movements led to additional reforms, including limits on interest rates and protections against the most severe penalties. The gradual transformation of debt law reflected Rome's efforts to balance social stability with economic flexibility. As Rome expanded its territory, debt assumed new dimensions. Conquests brought wealth, plunder, and new markets. Roman soldiers returning from campaigns sometimes used their spoils to repay debts or purchase land. At the same time, expansion introduced economic inequalities. Wealthy citizens acquired large estates, often purchasing land from indebted farmers who could no longer sustain their properties. These estates, worked increasingly by enslaved laborers captured in war, contributed to the decline of small-scale farming. Urban debt also grew during the Republic. Merchants, artisans, and shopkeepers borrowed money to fund their businesses, especially in Rome's growing commercial districts. Written contracts specified interest rates, repayment dates, and penalties for default. The Roman legal system allowed citizens to sue for repayment, and courts handled numerous debt cases. Because Roman law was extensive and detailed, creditors and debtors alike relied on legal professionals to navigate disputes. As the empire expanded, lending became more sophisticated. Wealthy Romans invested in trade ventures, construction projects, and land development. Some operate as professional lenders, offering loans across regions linked by Roman roads and sea routes. These lenders maintained records, employed agents, and managed long-distance financial relationships. Interest rates varied depending on risk, as in earlier societies, but Rome developed more formal mechanisms for enforcing contracts, including seizure of property. The role of publicans, private contractors who collected taxes and managed state revenues, also resapped. Roman debt structures. Publicans often advanced money to the state in exchange for the right to collect taxes in certain regions. This arrangement created large financial networks and introduced credit relationships between the state and private individuals. These financial interactions influenced political debates, as senators and equestrians sometimes clashed over the management of public funds. Debt also appeared in the everyday lives of urban residents. Rent, food, purchases, and household expenses could lead to borrowing, especially during times of economic stress. Ancient authors describe individuals struggling under the weight of interest payments, showing how deeply debt could affect personal circumstances. Even wealthy Romans sometimes borrowed money to maintain their lifestyles, fund political campaigns, or invest in construction projects. Legal reforms continued throughout the Republic and early Empire. Measures limited the maximum interest rate, prohibited certain forms of collateral, and provided procedures for restructuring debts. In times of crisis, emperors sometimes intervened to stabilize financial conditions. For example, in the early 2nd century, before the Common Era, widespread debt problems led to political upheaval, prompting calls for cancellation or adjustment of obligations. Although Rome did not adopt large-scale debt cancellations like Mesopotamia, targeted measures helped reduce immediate pressures. Economic fluctuations also influenced debt patterns. Periods of inflation, currency, debasement, or military disruption could alter the value of debts. During the late Republic, civil wars strained the economy and increased borrowing. Soldiers, administrators, and urban residents depended on credit to navigate uncertain conditions. As the empire emerged, the stability provided by imperial rule helped stabilize economic life. But debt remained an integral part of both private and public affairs. The administrative sophistication of the Roman Empire allowed for complex financial practices. Contracts included detailed clauses specifying interest, collateral, repayment schedules, and legal recourse. Courts enforced these agreements, making Roman law one of the most influential bodies of financial regulation in antiquity. Roman legal writings later shaped medieval and early modern European law, influencing how debt was understood long after the empire declined. Roman expansion intensified the consequences of debt for rural families. Many small farmers lost their land to creditors, or sold their property to avoid deeper financial trouble. These displaced farmers often moved to cities, contributing to urban crowding and changing the social landscape. The growth of large estates, supported by enslaved labor, transformed rural economies and reduced opportunities for small-scale farming. Debt in Rome was both a personal and a structural force. It affected individuals seeking to manage seasonal needs, entrepreneurs investing in trade, citizens participating in politics, and institutions managing public resources. Through centuries of growth and reform, debt shaped the development of Roman society and contributed to patterns that influenced the history of the Mediterranean world. As the Roman Republic expanded and its economy became more complex, Romans developed detailed legal structures to manage interest rates, collateral, and repayment obligations. Unlike earlier systems, which often relied on temple oversight or royal decrees, Rome approached debt through laws designed to regulate private lending between citizens. These laws formed one of the earliest sophistication financial frameworks in the ancient world and shaped principles that would influence legal systems for centuries. The foundation of Roman debt law appears in the 12 Tables, compiled in the mid-5th century before the Common Era. These laws outlined procedures for acknowledging debt, demanding repayment, and resolving disputes. They reflected the concerns of a society in which borrowing was common, especially among small farmers and urban workers. The 12 Tables attempted to create predictable rules to protect both lenders and borrowers, reducing the potential for arbitrary treatment or abuse. One of the earliest provisions concerned the handling of overdue debts. If a borrower failed to repay on time, the creditor could bring the debtor before a magistrate. After a set period, if repayment still had not occurred, the creditor could seize the debtor as pro pertior. In some cases, claim the debtor's labor under controlled conditions. This practice evolved over time, with later reforms limiting the ability of creditors to detain individuals. The legal procedures demonstrate how seriously Rome treated debt as a matter requiring formal, orderly resolution. Interest rates also became a central legal topic. Roman society recognized that lending involved risk and that interest compensated lenders for delayed repayment or potential loss. However, unchecked interests could burden borrowers and destabilize society. To balance these concerns, Roman lawmakers periodically imposed limits known as usury laws. One early regulation capped interest at one wealth of the principal per year, roughly 8.33%. Later, the Lex Genutia of 342, before the Common Era, reportedly prohibited interest entirely, though the ban appears to have been difficult to enforce and may not have lasted long. By the late Republic, interest rates often ranged from 12 to 24%, depending on risk. Commercial ventures or loans involving distant travel might carry higher rates. In contrast, loans secured by substantial collateral or involving trusted parties generally carried lower rates. Roman legal writers, such as Cicero and later jurists, discuss interests with precision, reflecting a financial culture that understood varying levels of risk and the need for legal clarity. Collateral property, pledged as security for a loan, played a major role in Roman debt law. Borrowers could use land, houses, slaves, livestock, or other assets as collateral. If repayment failed, creditors had legal pathways to claim these assets. Two major forms of collateral arrangements existed: fiducia and pignus. Fiducia involved transferring ownership of the collateral to the creditor until the loan was repaid. Although practical, this system placed significant power in the hands of lenders, who technically owned the property during the loan period. Over time, pignus, or pledge, became more common. In this arrangement, the borrower retained ownership of the pledged asset, while giving the creditor the right to claim it only in case of default. This system created greater security for borrowers while still protecting lenders. Roman legal procedures required careful documentation of collateral. Written contracts specified the value of the pledged property, the terms of repayment, and the rights of both parties. Courts examined these documents when disputes arose, ensuring that agreements followed legal standards. The emphasis on written contracts distinguished the Roman approach from earlier systems in which oral agreements played a larger role. The expansion of Roman territory brought new financial challenges. As soldiers traveled and merchants operated across provinces, long-distance lending increased. Roman law adapted by creating additional legal tools, such as a form of collateral that allowed creditors to claim property even while it remained in the borrower's possession and use. Hypotheca was especially useful in provincial land transactions, estates, and commercial ventures. Because it did not require physical transfer of property, it enabled more flexible economic activity. Despite these tools, debt crises continued to affect Roman society. Economic downturns, military disruptions, or currency fluctuations could make repayment difficult for large numbers of citizens. Roman lawmakers responded with various reforms. Some limited repeated interest charges that accumulated beyond the original principal. Others attempted to reduce the total debt burden by allowing partial forgiveness or restructuring of loans. During the late Republic, economic inequality intensified as wealthy elites used credit to acquire land from indebted smallholders. Large estates expanded while rural families struggled to remain independent. Political leaders debated debt reform frequently, with some proposing cancellations and others defending creditor rights. These debates reflected broader tensions within Roman society, especially between traditional aristocratic power and the growing needs of the urban and rural poor. Collateral laws also shaped the social landscape of Rome. The ability to pledge property allowed individuals to access credit, but it also created a system in which property loss could shift economic and social status. For many families, a single failed harvest or business setback could lead to losing land or tools essential for survival. Once lost, recovering property became difficult, contributing to long-term inequality. Urban residents faced different pressures. Rent, food, expenses, and business costs often led to borrowing. Collateral typically took the form of household goods or future earnings. Lenders relied on courts to enforce repayment, and urban legal cases frequently involved disputes over debt. These cases show how deeply financial obligations permeated daily life in Rome. The legal sophistication of Roman debt and collateral laws contributed to the broader development of Roman jurisprudence. Roman jurists analyzed lending practices, clarified legal terminology, and established principles that became foundational in later European law. Concepts such as interest limitations, collateral rights, and contractual obligations influenced medieval canon law, Renaissance legal codes, and early modern financial systems. Roman authors provide additional insight into attitudes toward debt. Cicero, for example, wrote about the dangers of excessive borrowing and the responsibilities of wealthy lenders. Philosophers such as Seneca discussed the moral dimensions of debt, emphasizing self-control and moderation. These writings show that Romans viewed debt not only as a legal and economic matter, but also as part of ethical and social life. The enforcement of debt laws depended on Rome's courts, magistrates, and administrative structures. Judges evaluated contracts, witnesses, and collateral claims. Their decisions reinforced legal expectations and maintained order. The consistency of Roman legal decisions contributed to the durability of the system, ensuring that debt relationships remain predictable across generations. In the provinces, Roman debt law interacted with local customs. While Roman principles applied broadly, provincial communities adapted them to regional practices. This flexibility allowed the Roman Empire to incorporate diverse economic cultures while maintaining a unified legal framework. Through centuries of expansion, reform, and adaptation, Rome built a debt system that combined legal precision, economic practicality, and social regulation. Interest and collateral laws created a foundation for credit relationships that supported agriculture, trade, and public administration. At the same time, these laws reflected the challenges and inequalities of Roman society, shaping patterns of wealth, property ownership, and political conflict. The enduring influence of Roman financial law demonstrates how deeply debt shaped the ancient world, not only as an economic tool, but as a force that touched every aspect of civic life. Across the ancient world, land was more than property. It represented security, identity, and survival. Families depended on their fields for food, income, and social status. Because land carried such importance, debt and land ownership became deeply connected. When households borrowed grain, silver, or tools, they often pledged land as collateral. When they could not repay, they risked losing their fields, altering the structure of entire communities. The relationship between debt and land ownership reveals how economic pressures shaped social systems and influenced long-term patterns of inequality. In Mesopotamia, early debt contracts sometimes required borrowers to pledge plots of land. These plots varied in size, ranging from small fields near canals to larger holdings managed by extended families. Land was valued according to its fertility, irrigation access, and location. If a borrower failed to repay a grain loan after the harvest, lenders could claim temporary control of the land. In some cases, the land remained under the borrower's name, but the lender collected the harvest until the debt was satisfied. This arrangement ensured that production continued while providing compensation to the creditor. Over time, repeated failures to repay could lead to permanent loss of land. When this happened on a large scale, rulers intervened with debt cancellation decrees to return land to its original owners. These decrees protected the structure of rural society, ensuring that families retained their economic foundations. The frequent need for restoration shows how fragile land ownership could become when debt pressures mounted. In Egypt, the connection between debt and land was shaped by the centralized state. Much arable land belonged to the crown, temples, or elite households. Farmers working on these lands did not always own their fields, but they were responsible for paying grain taxes and fulfilling labor obligations. When debts accumulated, the state could reassign land or adjust tax requirements. Because the government maintained large grain reserves, it could issue loans to farmers to help them continue working their plots. If repayment failed, the state had mechanisms to redistribute land while preserving agricultural productivity. This system created a dynamic relationship between households and the state. Land tenure depended on fulfilling obligations, including tax payments and debt repayment. Loss of land often led to relocation or changes in social status. Yet the state's intervention prevented the formation of extreme inequalities in some periods. Grain lending and redistribution helped maintain stability even when conditions were difficult. In Greece, particularly in early Athens, land ownership was central to citizenship and political participation. Farmers who borrowed against their land risked losing the foundation of their social identity. Before the reforms of Solon, many small farmers pledged their land to wealthier creditors. When they could not repay, they sometimes became dependent laborers on their former fields. This process intensified social divisions and contributed to widespread unrest. Solon's reforms addressed these issues by canceling debts secured on the person and preventing the use of personal freedom as collateral. However, land remained vulnerable to economic pressures. Greek inscriptions and legal documents show that land sales often occurred because of debt. Families under financial strain sold portions of their fields to repay obligations, sometimes fragmenting ancestral holdings. These sales contributed to the rise of larger estates in some regions, particularly where wealthy landowners accumulated property from indebted farmers. The pattern repeated across generations, shaping rural landscapes. In the Greek world, the connection between debt and land ownership extended to colonies. As Greek settlements expanded around the Mediterranean, new colonists received land allocations. These lands provided fresh opportunities, but colonists also took loans to develop their fields, purchase tools, or build storage facilities. When debts became overwhelming, colonists sometimes abandoned their holdings or sold them to neighbors. This process reflected broader economic vulnerabilities across the Greek world. In Rome, debt and land ownership intertwined deeply with politics. During the early Republic, many small farmers served in the army. Military campaigns required long periods away from home, leaving fields untended. If harvests suffered, farmers needed loans to sustain their households. When they returned from service, they sometimes faced large debts and pressure from creditors. This situation contributed to early social conflicts and demanded reforms. As Rome expanded, the problem intensified. Wealthy Romans purchased land from indebted farmers, creating vast estates known as These estates were often worked by enslaved laborers, captured during conquests. The growth of latifundia reduced opportunities for small farmers and contributed to population movement toward Rome, where displaced families sought work in urban areas. Debt played a major role in this transformation. As economic pressures reshaped both rural and urban environments, Roman law recognized the importance of land and developed detailed procedures for using it as collateral. Borrowers could pledge land through contracts that outlined boundaries, estimated value, and conditions of forfeiture. If the borrower defaulted, the creditor could claim the land or its produce. Courts played a central role in adjudicating disputes, ensuring that transfers followed legal standards. Written contracts, maps, and witness statements reinforced the formal nature of these transactions. Land was also central to inheritance. Families pass holdings to their children, ensuring continuity across generations. But if a family accumulated debt, inherited land could be divided or sold to satisfy creditors. This fragmentation sometimes weakened family fortunes, affecting their status for generations. The connection between debt and inheritance shows how financial instability could persist long after the original borrower was gone. Provincial regions under Roman rule faced similar dynamics. Farmers in Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and Asia Minor borrowed grain or money to invest in vines, olive trees, irrigation, or livestock. When debts accumulated, land sales increased, reshaping local economies. Provincial inscriptions mention disputes over land boundaries, repayments, and collateral claims, showing how deeply Roman financial principles spread beyond Italy. Debt and land ownership also affected social mobility. In societies where land determined status, losing property could reduce a family's influence, while acquiring land increased wealth and political power. Borrowing created opportunities for investment, but it also carried the risk of losing land if projects failed. This tension between opportunity and vulnerability shaped economic life across the ancient world. Archaeological evidence supports the connection between debt and land. In many regions, boundary stones, tax records, and agricultural inventories showed transfers of property that align with known periods of economic strain. Tablets describing land pledges, maps showing estate consolidation, and inscriptions recording disputes help reconstruct the economic landscape shaped by debt. The relationship between debt and land ownership reveals the practical challenges of ancient life. Households needed resources to survive seasonal cycles, invest in agriculture, or manage unexpected expenses. Borrowing provided those resources, but carried risks that could alter family fortunes. The loss or fragmentation of land affected not only individual households, but entire communities, leading to changes in settlement patterns, social organization, and political structures. Through centuries of adaptation, ancient societies developed systems to manage the link between debt and land ownership. Legal reforms, state interventions, and social customs all played roles in balancing the needs of households with broader economic stability. Despite these efforts, debt remained a powerful force capable of reshaping landscapes, identities, and historical trajectories. War placed unique pressures on ancient economies. Armies required food, weapons, transportation, shelters, and payments for soldiers. These demands stretched the resources of states and communities, pushing rulers to develop systems of financing military campaigns. Debt became one of the most important tools in this process. Whether through borrowing grain, silver, or labor, ancient societies relied on credit to sustain long campaigns and managed the disruptions that warfare created in everyday life. In Mesopotamia, early city-states often assembled armies during periods of conflict with neighboring regions. Mobilizing an army required significant resources: grain for rations, draft animals for transport, and supplies for the soldiers. Temples and palace institutions stored grain and silver that could be issued to support military campaigns. These advances functioned as loans from the central institutions to the military, and repayment depended on the outcome of the conflict. Victories could yield plunder, tribute, or territorial expansion, allowing rulers to repay debts and replenish storehouses. Some tablets record allocations of grain or materials to soldiers or officials, indicating how resources were mobilized during military operations. These allocations often created temporary obligations. Officials were responsible for returning unused supplies or compensating the temple or palace after the campaign. This system allowed Mesopotamian states to maintain military readiness even when immediate resources were limited. Hipe, the centralized state organized military provisioning through its network of granaries and administrative centers. When the pharaoh launched campaigns into Nubia, the Levant, or other regions, armies required substantial quantities of grain to sustain long journeys. The state issued grain from granaries as advances to soldiers, officials, or transport crews. These distributions were recorded in administrative documents and treated as temporary allocations. After the campaign, officials reconciled accounts, returning surplus grain or reporting losses. Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions describe the movement of supplies along well-organized routes. Barges carried grain up and down the Nile, supplying troops stationed at border fortresses or assembling for expeditions. Because grain served as both food and a medium of exchange, managing grain debt allowed the state to direct military logistics effectively. In this system, credit did not only involve households, but extended to officials managing the needs of the army. In Greece, war financing developed within the political structure of independent cities. Athens provides the most detailed evidence. During the 5th century, before the Common Era, Athens expanded its naval power, building fleets of triremes that required wood, metal, skilled labor, and steady pay for rowers. To support these expenses, Athens relied on a combination of taxes, tributes from allied states, and public borrowing. Wealthy citizens were often required to fund public expenses known as liturgies, which included financing ships or paying for festival events. These liturgies acted as a form of civic debt. Individuals provided resources to the state and gained social prestige in return. During wartime, Athens also used loans from sacred treasuries. The most famous example involves the Delian League treasury, which the Athenians transferred to their own city. Funds intended for collective defense were used to build ships, fortify walls, and support the needs of war. These allocations functioned as loans from allied resources, repayable through future tribute or spoils of war. The blending of sacred and civic funds demonstrates how deeply debt penetrated political Greek hoplite soldiers, who equipped themselves for battle, sometimes borrowed money to purchase armor, shields, and weapons. These items were expensive, and families unable to afford them relied on loans from wealthier citizens. Repayment depended on agricultural productivity or household income. These obligations show that military service and personal debt were closely linked. War also created a financial strain on small communities. When adult men left their fields to fight, agricultural production declined, increasing the need for borrowing. Households borrowed grain or money to survive until the campaign ended. In some cases, military failure deepened the burden of debt. If a city lost territory or suffered heavy casualties, repayment became even more difficult. These patterns reveal how war amplified economic vulnerability. Rome developed a more structured approach to war financing as it expanded from Italy into a Mediterranean empire. Early Roman soldiers were expected to equip themselves, and households often borrowed money to cover the cost. This link between debt and military service contributed to social tensions in the early Republic. As Rome expanded, military campaigns grew longer and more complex, requiring large-scale provisioning. To support war efforts, Rome imposed taxes, seized resources, and engaged in public borrowing. Families of soldiers sometimes received grain or money from local communities, creating temporary obligations that required settlement when soldiers returned. Roman commanders also advanced pay or distributed plunder as a form of repayment for military service. These payments helped soldiers manage debts incurred before the campaign. During the late Republic, war financing became entangled with political ambition. Generals seeking to maintain their armies borrowed large sums from wealthy supporters, expecting repayment from future victories. Julius Caesar, for example, accumulated significant debts before his rise to power. His military successes in Gaul allowed him to repay creditors, secure political influence, and continue his campaigns. In this context, debt became a tool for building military and political authority. Publicani Roman tax contractors played a major role in war financing. These private groups advanced money to the state in exchange for tax collection rights in conquered territories. Their activities created complex financial networks, linking public debt with private credit. In times of conflict, Publicani extended loans to support military logistics, expecting repayment through tax revenues or captured resources. This system integrated private capital into state operations. War financing also affected conquered regions. Provinces were often required to supply grain, animals, or money to support Roman armies. These obligations created forms of debt between provinces and the central government. Provincial communities borrowed from local elites to meet Roman demands, spreading debt across different levels of society. In some regions, these pressures contributed to long-term economic challenges. Across ancient civilizations, war reshaped economic landscapes. Armies consumed large quantities of resources, disrupted trade routes, and displaced populations. Debt helped societies manage these disruptions. It allowed armies to mobilize quickly, provided essential supplies, and created structures for repaying obligations. At the same time, borrowing intensified inequalities, placing heavy burdens on households and communities. Archaeological evidence supports the central role of credit in war. Tablets record allocations of grain to soldiers, inscriptions detailed payments for equipment, and papyrus documents describe financial transfers between state treasuries. These records show that war could not be sustained without organized systems of credit. The connection between war and debt demonstrates how ancient societies balanced immediate needs with long-term stability. Borrowing allowed governments to respond rapidly to external threats, but repayment required strong administrative systems and predictable economic conditions. When these conditions faltered, debt accumulated and contributed to broader crises. The financing of war illustrates a consistent pattern in ancient history. The more complex a society became, the more deeply debt was woven into its political and economic processes. Through these mechanisms, debt shaped not only the outcomes of individual conflicts, but also the development of states and empires across centuries. The introduction of coinage transformed ancient economies. Before coins, wealth moved in the form of grain, livestock, metals by weight, or written credits recorded on tablets and papyrus. These systems worked, but they required careful measurement and trusted intermediaries. Coins changed this by creating standardized units of value that could be exchanged quickly and recognized across large regions. As coins spread throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, they reshaped debt practices, making credit more flexible, more portable, and more deeply integrated into daily life. The earliest widely circulated coins appeared in Lydia, in western Anatolia, during the 7th century before the Common Era, made from electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. These coins carried stamped symbols, indicating weight and purity. Their introduction simplified trade. Instead of weighing metal for each transaction, people could rely on the statute mark. This reliability encouraged borrowing and lending, because coins offered a predictable store of value and made repayments easier to calculate. As Greek city-states adopted coinage, their economies expanded. Silver coins from Athens, Corinth, and other cities circulated widely. Athenian owls, stamped with the image of Athena, became one of the most recognizable currencies in the ancient world. The widespread acceptance of these coins helped merchants, farmers, and craftsmen participate in trade more efficiently. It also increased the use of credit, as loans could now be issued in coin rather than bulk goods. Coinage enabled more complex financial transactions. In earlier systems, lending grain or livestock required physical storage and transportation. Coins removed these burdens. A lender could provide a small bag of silver coins with clear markings, and the borrower could use the coins in markets far beyond their home region. This portability allowed credit to support long-distance trade more effectively. Merchants could borrow coins in one city, travel hundreds of kilometers, and repay the debt with profits earned abroad. Greek maritime loans benefited greatly from coinage. With standardized currency, merchants could calculate interest, convert exchange rates, and settle debts across ports in the Aegean, Black Sea, and Eastern Mediterranean. Coins made financial relationships more flexible and allowed credit systems to expand alongside maritime commerce. They also supported the development of banking-like practices, as money changers and lenders began managing deposits, issuing loans, and facilitating payments for travelers. Coinage also influenced everyday borrowing. In cities such as Athens, individuals borrowed coins for legal expenses, festival participation, property purchases, or family needs. These loans were documented in written contracts or oral agreements witnessed by neighbors. Coins simplified repayment, reducing disputes over valuation and measurement. This clarity allowed credit to become a routine part of urban life. The Roman adoption of coinage marked another important development. Early Roman coins appeared in the 3rd century before the Common Era, initially modeled on Greek currency systems. As Rome expanded, it created its own standardized denominations of bronze, silver, and later gold. The Roman denarius became a dominant currency across the Mediterranean. Its stability and wide circulation allowed credit to operate across vast distances, linking provinces through shared monetary values. Roman soldiers were paid in coin, which tied military service directly to the monetary economy. Soldiers often sent their wages home, used them to repay family debts, or saved them to purchase land after their service. This steady flow of coinage into rural communities increased the availability of cash and encouraged new forms of borrowing. Farmers, craftsmen, and traders began using coins in everyday transactions, creating a more interconnected financial system. Coinage also played a role in public debt. Roman governments issued payments to contractors, publicani, and provincial administrators using coin, creating obligations that were repaid through taxes collected in the same currency. This alignment strengthened administrative efficiency. In times of crisis, the state sometimes debased the currency, reducing the metal content of coins to stretch resources further. This practice affected debt relationships by altering the value of repayment. Debtors could repay loans in coins with less silver content, while creditors faced reduced value. These changes could cause tension, revealing the delicate balance between monetary policy and financial stability. As coinage spread, new forms of collateral arose. Borrowers could pledge coins themselves, making collateral more precise and divisible. They could also pledge income streams, such as rents or tax revenues, because coin-based economies made these values easier to calculate. This flexibility encouraged more sophisticated credit arrangements, including long-term loans and investment partnerships. Coinage influenced social practices as well. In societies where coins became common, dowries, inheritances, and household savings began to include monetary amounts. Families stored coins in pottery containers or buried them for safekeeping. Archaeological discoveries of coin hoards provide evidence of this practice. Some hoards contain coins from multiple regions, showing the extent of ancient economic networks. These hoards reflect not only personal savings, but also the uncertainties of war and political upheaval. When individuals hid their resources to protect them from confiscation or theft, the shift from grain and silver-based credit to coin-based credit also changed measurement systems. Before coins, interest calculations often used volume measures, such as liters of barley. Wheat coinaje interest could be expressed as a percentage of a fixed monetary amount. This made record-keeping more straightforward and allowed legal systems to define interest limits more clearly. Roman law, in particular, benefited from coinage, which supported its precise formulations of interest rates, collateral procedures, and repayment schedules. In the broader ancient world, coins facilitated economic integration. Regions connected by trade routes, land or sea, could now exchange goods and services using shared monetary standards. Credit followed these routes. A merchant borrowing coins in Carthage could repay in Alexandria or Rhodes, as long as currency exchange mechanisms existed. This mobility strengthened commercial relationships and allowed economic systems to expand beyond local boundaries. Coinage also affected state revenue systems. Taxes could now be collected in standardized units, enabling governments to plan expenditures more precisely. This clarity supported state-sponsored construction projects, military campaigns, and administrative activities. When states borrowed money, coin-based accounting allowed them to record obligations in consistent terms. This development laid the foundation for more advanced public finance practices in later periods. The introduction of coinage did not eliminate earlier credit systems. Grain loans continued in agricultural communities, especially where coinage was scarce. Livestock loans remained common in pastoral regions. But coins expanded the possibilities for credit, making borrowing and lending more adaptable to diverse economic needs. They supported both local and long-distance trade, urban growth, and state administration. Archaeological evidence of coin circulation hoards, mint records, weights, and inscriptions reveals how deeply coins penetrated ancient societies. Economic life became more fluid, allowing individuals to manage obligations with greater precision. Credit systems grew more complex, reflecting the broader changes that coinage introduced. The spread of coinage marked a transition in how ancient civilizations understood value, exchange, and obligation. By creating standardized units of currency, states enabled credit to become more sophisticated and wide. The combination of coinage and debt transformed economic landscapes, supporting the rise of empires and the expansion of commercial networks across centuries. Debt did more than shape individual households in the ancient world. It had the power to reshape entire societies. When obligations became too heavy or too widespread, communities faced instability. Periods of drought, war, or political change often increased borrowing, pushing families into financial strain. When many households fell behind at once, ancient states confronted not only economic problems but also social conflict. Debt crises revealed how closely economic life was tied to social order and how deeply financial strain could influence political developments. In Mesopotamia, early rulers issued debt cancellations precisely because they recognized the dangers of widespread indebtedness. When too many farmers lost land or entered servitude, agricultural productivity declined. Families forced into debt servitude could not work their own fields, disrupting local economies. Communities weakened under this pressure, and rulers risked losing support from the population. Debt cancellation decrees, which freed individuals and restored land, served as a mechanism for restoring stability. The need for regular cancellations indicates how often economic shocks occurred. Poor harvests, unstable water supplies, or external conflict could push entire regions into crises. Tablets referencing these cancellations show how quickly debt could accumulate and how deeply it affected rural life. While these decrees temporarily relieved pressure, they also reflected the structural vulnerabilities of ancient farming communities. In Egypt, famine or poor flood seasons created similar pressures. Although the state attempted to stabilize grain supplies through its central granaries, prolonged shortages could overwhelm even the best organized systems. When households borrowed grain repeatedly without sufficient harvests to repay, the burden grew. Administrative documents describe periods when communities struggled to meet obligations, indicating strain across multiple districts. Egyptian officials sometimes adjusted taxes or redistributed grain to prevent unrest, showing how economic conditions shaped administrative decisions. Greek city-states experienced more direct social conflict over debt. In early Athens, many small farmers pledged their land or personal freedom as collateral. When they could not repay, their land passed into the hands of wealthier citizens, and some families faced bondage. These conditions created deep resentment and contributed to political demands for reform. Solon's Sysaktia, which abolished debt bondage and freed those enslaved for debt, marked a major turning point. It reflected the recognition that economic inequality could destabilize the entire community. Even after Solon's reforms, debt continued to influence Athenian politics. Later conflicts between democratic and oligarchic factions often intensified during periods of economic difficulty. Debt pressures contributed to factional struggles, showing how financial instability could shape political alignments. Other Greek city-states faced similar issues. In Sparta, reforms attributed to Lycurgus attempted to prevent wealth concentration by restricting forms of currency and property transfer. While the historical accuracy of these accounts is debated, they reflect broader concerns about the destabilizing effects of debt and inequality. In many regions, cycles of land concentration and indebtedness drove social tensions and influenced local governance. Rome offers some of the most detailed evidence of how debt crises could escalate into political conflict. Throughout the early republic, debt served as a central issue in the struggle between patricians and plebeians. Many plebeian farmers, burdened by military service and irregular harvests, fell into debt. Creditors demanded repayment, sometimes using harsh measures. Stories of debtors imprisoned or physically restrained appear in Roman tradition, illustrating how extreme these tensions could become. These conditions contributed to the plebeian secessions moments, when large groups of plebeians withdrew from the city to protest their treatment. During these crises, the Roman government was forced to negotiate reforms, including restrictions on interest, limits on creditor power, and procedures for rehabilitating indebted farmers. These reforms gradually expanded plebeian rights and reshaped Roman political structures. Debt crises re-emerged throughout Roman history. During the late Republic, economic inequality grew as war profits enriched elite families. Small farmers, unable to compete with large estates, often sold their land and moved to cities, where debt remained a constant risk. Political leaders such as the Gracchi attempted to address these problems through land redistribution and legal reforms, though their efforts sparked intense conflict. Civil wars of the 1st century, before the Common Era, created additional financial strain. Armies required supplies, cities endured sieges, and trade routes were disrupted. Many households borrowed heavily to survive, and repayment became difficult amid unstable conditions. Leaders occasionally proposed debt relief, but such measures were controversial. The tension surrounding debt contributed to broader political upheaval that transformed the republic into an empire. Debt crises also appeared in the provinces. Conquered regions had to pay taxes, supply soldiers, and contribute grain to Rome. These demands sometimes overwhelmed local economies. Provincial communities borrowed from wealthy local elites to meet Roman obligations, creating complex layers of Over time, some provinces experienced severe economic imbalance, prompting reforms in taxation and administration. The social effects of debt extended beyond political conflict. In many regions, chronic indebtedness led to demographic changes. Families migrated in search of opportunities, abandoned unproductive land, or relocated to urban centers where wage labor offered more reliable income. These movements altered settlement patterns and contributed to the growth of cities. Religious and philosophical writings also reflect anxiety about debt. In Greece, historians and playwrights described the hardships of indebted families. In Rome, authors such as Livy, Cicero, and Plutarch commented on the dangers of excessive borrowing and the social consequences of inequality. Their writings reveal a widespread recognition that debt could undermine both personal stability and public order. Archaeological evidence confirms the impact of debt crises. Changes in land ownership patterns, fluctuations in coin hoards, and records of property disputes all point to periods of economic stress. In some regions, rapid shifts in settlement structures correspond with documented episodes of social unrest, suggesting that debt played a role in reshaping communities. Debt crises highlight the fragility of ancient economic systems. Agriculture depended heavily on weather, trade relied on safe routes, and state finances fluctuated with political conditions. In this context, credit helped societies manage risk by providing temporary relief. But when too many households faced simultaneous pressures, the system could not absorb the strain. Ancient responses to debt crises revealed the tools available to early states: cancellation, tax adjustments, legal reforms, and redistribution of land. These measures aimed to restore balance, though they varied widely in scope and effectiveness. In many cases, they prevented immediate collapse, but did not eliminate underlying vulnerabilities. Through these patterns, debt emerges as a force that shaped not only economic life, but also social cohesion. Its influence extended from household decisions to political structures, illustrating how deeply financial obligations were woven into the fabric of ancient civilizations. The systems of borrowing, lending, and repayment developed in ancient civilizations did not disappear when those societies fell. Their structures, principles, and administrative practices shaped the financial traditions that followed. Debt, in its many forms, became a long-lasting part of human history. The ways ancient peoples managed obligation, risk, and trust laid a foundation for later economies and legal systems, influencing how societies across different eras approached financial relationships. One of the most enduring legacies of ancient debt practices is the development of written contracts. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the papyrus documents of Egypt and the inscriptions of Greece and Rome, ancient societies treated financial agreements as matters that required clear, documented terms. These records established expectations, reduced disputes, and created accountability. The habit of writing down obligations became a cornerstone of later legal systems, forming the basis for modern contract law. The principle that financial agreements must be documented, witnessed, and enforceable has its roots in these early practices. The standardization of interest was another influential development. Ancient societies experimented with different rates for different types of loans, depending on risk and economic conditions. By regulating interest, Mesopotamian kings, Athenian lawmakers, and Roman jurists helped establish norms that persisted through medieval and early modern Europe. The idea that interest should be limited or regulated to protect borrowers became part of religious, philosophical, and legal traditions. These debates shaped later financial reform, affecting banking systems and credit markets long after the ancient world had changed. The connection between land and debt also left a lasting impact. In many ancient societies, mortgage-like arrangements allowed individuals to use land as collateral. When borrowers could not repay, land could transfer to creditors, influencing patterns of ownership and inequality. These practices laid the groundwork for later property law. Concepts such as foreclosure, collateral rights, and land titling trace their origins to ancient procedures. The relationship between debt and property remained central to social and economic systems for centuries. Ancient methods of managing debt crises also influenced later states. Mesopotamian rulers issued decrees canceling debts, while Greek reforms and Roman laws addressed public pressure during times of strain. These responses demonstrate early recognition that economic systems required periodic intervention to maintain social stability. Later societies adopted similar strategies, from medieval debt amnesties to early modern bankruptcy laws. Although the mechanisms changed, the principle remained. Societies must balance the rights of creditors with the welfare of the population. Coinage further extended the legacy of ancient debt. By creating standardized units of value, ancient states enabled more complex credit arrangements. Coin-based lending supported long-distance trade, state finance, and everyday transactions. These practices paved the way for later banking systems, merchant credit networks, and financial institutions in the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. The use of coinage as a basis for interest calculations, collateral valuation, and contract enforcement became a lasting feature of economic life. Ancient systems of public debt also influenced later governments. Rome's use of loans from publicani, advances from private lenders, and tax-based repayment formed early examples of state borrowing. As later states developed, they adopted similar tools, issuing public debt, establishing treasuries, and regulating financial interactions between the government and private citizens. These traditions shaped the emergence of national debt systems in the medieval and early modern world. Another significant legacy lies in administrative techniques. Ancient scribes, tax collectors, and legal officials developed methods for tracking loans, repayments, and outstanding obligations. These techniques included standardized accounting, data storage, and reporting systems that later influenced commercial bookkeeping and public administration. The careful record-keeping seen in ancient granaries, temples, and legal offices contributed to the evolution of accounting practices still used today. The social dimensions of debt also left enduring marks. Ancient experiences with debt crises revealed how financial strain could lead to unrest, migration, and political change. Later societies recognized similar patterns during periods of economic difficulty. The idea that financial pressures could destabilize society became an important principle in political thought, influencing policies aimed at preventing large-scale hardship. The historical memory of debt crises shaped attitudes toward taxation, redistribution, and state intervention. Cultural and philosophical reflections on debt also persisted. Greek and Roman authors wrote extensively about the moral implications of borrowing and lending. They emphasized moderation, responsibility, and the dangers of excessive debt. These ideas influenced early Christian teachings, medieval philosophy, and Renaissance thought. Discussions of debt as both an economic and ethical issue continued into the modern era, showing how ancient perspectives shaped long-term cultural attitudes. The continuity of debt practices can also be seen in migration and settlement patterns. In many regions, ancient communities fragmented or restructured because of detrilated land transfers, economic downturns, or military disruptions. These patterns continued through later periods as economic pressures reshaped rural landscapes and urban centers. The long-term effects of ancient debt influenced demographic changes, land distribution, and social organization. Even the concept of bankruptcy has distant roots in ancient attempts to balance creditor demands with societal stability. While ancient societies did not always formalize bankruptcy procedures, their methods of restructuring or canceling debt reflected early recognition of the need for such mechanisms. Later legal systems drew on these traditions, creating structured ways to resolve financial insolvency. Debt also played a role in shaping early forms of banking. Money changers, lenders, and merchants who managed credit relationships in Greece and Rome created practices that resembled modern banking activities. They handled deposits, issued loans, and facilitated payments. These early financial specialists influenced the development of medieval and Renaissance banking families, such as those in Italy, who expanded these concepts into more formal institutions. The influence of ancient debt systems extends into modern economic thought. Scholars and policymakers study these early practices to understand the origins of credit, inequality, and financial crises. The records preserved on tablets, papyri, and inscriptions provide valuable insights into long-term patterns of economic behavior. These sources reveal how ancient societies managed risk, responded to hardship, and organized financial life with remarkable sophistication. The legacy of ancient debt is visible in many modern institutions. Contract law, property rights, interest regulations, public finance, and administrative systems all trace their origins to early practices. The continuity of these ideas demonstrates how deeply debt is embedded in human societies. It has served as a tool for opportunity, a source of hardship, and a mechanism for organizing relationships between individuals, households, and states. Through their responses to debt, ancient civilizations shaped economic structures that lasted long after their political systems changed. The principles they developed continue to influence how societies manage obligation, risk, and financial stability. Today, across the ancient world, debt shaped the daily lives of farmers, merchants, officials, soldiers, and entire communities. It emerged not as a secondary feature of early economies, but as a central mechanism that allowed societies to manage uncertainty, allocate resources, and maintain production. Whether expressed in grain, silver, or stamped coins, debt linked households to institutions and tied local economies to broader regional networks. Mesopotamian clay tablets revealed the earliest structures of credit, complete with standardized interest and written contracts. Egyptian granaries show how centralized states used lending to support agricultural stability. Greek maritime loans and Roman legal codes illustrate the growing sophistication of credit systems as trade expanded and societies became more interconnected. Each region adapted lending practices to its environment, creating diverse but recognizable forms of economic organization. Debt influenced more than finances. It shaped land ownership, reinforced social hierarchies, and contributed to political reforms. Periodic debt cancellations in Mesopotamia, the Sysakhthia in Athens, and various Roman laws all demonstrate how closely economic pressures were tied to social stability. When obligations grew too heavy, communities turned to legal and administrative solutions to restore balance. The introduction of coinage expanded possibilities for credit, allowing ancient economies to develop more flexible and portable systems of exchange. Coins supported long-distance trade, facilitated public finance, and contributed to the formation of more complex administrative systems. As lending practices evolved, they laid foundations for later developments in contract law, property rights, and public debt. The legacy of these ancient systems continues into the present. Modern financial institutions, legal structures, and economic policies reflect principles first established in early civilizations. Through their efforts to manage obligation and risk, ancient societies shaped economic patterns that endure across centuries, demonstrating how deeply debt is woven into the structure of human history.